I want to show you a demonstration of the filter, edit, delete example. So this table can be filtered. At the moment, it's only filtering on the payee. So if I type in SUB, then you just see Subway, WEN, then you see Wendy's, and COS, let me see Costco. And if I type in just W, then we see Subway and Wendy's because W's in both of them. And I can delete an item with delete here, and then I can edit an item, and it brings up this edit menu. And if I change the order so that this one is later, so change the ID, at the moment it's ordering by the check number, and so I can change that to not being void, and then save. And you can see that this has now jumped to the bottom. In the example, you're wanting to do this by date, but I've not put date in this. I've just put check number. So this is kind of a more simple example. So this is index.js, and this is the entry point to our application. Here I'm loading in Redux. I'm also loading in Redux Saga, and I'm creating my Redux store here, which takes in a root reducer and also takes in some Saga middleware. More about that later. The Saga middleware is basically what is handling our side effects. So that's things like calling the database or anything that we do over the network. And I've created a fake API here. So this is like a fake REST endpoint. And so I've got some fake kind of JSON data in here and some API calls. So normally these would be calling fetch, which returns a promise, and fetch is a kind of web standard, more recent than kind of Ajax. So let's take a look at the root reducer. So here's the root reducer, and this is basically just taking in two other reducers. We've got the rows reducer and the filter reducer, and I'll take a look at those. So the filter reducer is just setting the filter that you can see here. We've got like a set filter action, and all it's going to do is update the state to have whatever filter action you've typed in there. And the next reducer is the table reducer. This is the main reducer, and this has all the actions that you can do on rows, basically. So we've got edit row, and here we're only dealing with successful actions. So you can imagine that that a HTTP request might not return successfully, and so if you attempt to edit a row and it doesn't succeed, then you don't want this to be called. So edit and add are both doing exactly the same thing, that they take in an action which has a new kind of row state, and then they assign that to the correct row. This is kind of ES 2015 notation. And then indexed init row succeeded. This is just a way of initializing the store with all of the rows from our database. So it takes in multiple rows, and it's actually just going to return whatever it receives as an action. So it just initializes the internal in-memory store for this application. And then delete row delete row succeeded is going to clone the current internal memory store. So that's what this is doing, this notation here, spreading in the previous state. And then it's going to delete the row with the action ID that we want to delete, and then it's going to return this cloned store. So this is using the pattern that Redux normally uses. So Redux defines a reducer as something that takes in a state and an action, and it returns a new state depending on the action. And these states are immutable, and that means that we're not changing the state by the action. We're creating a new state. That's why we go through this step of cloning the previous state and then changing and then removing an item. and this gives us properties like time travel. So our Redux reducer is what changes the state of our Redux store, and our Redux store is really the in-memory copy of our business data. So it's been taken from our API data when it's loaded into the client, and when we want to manipulate this data, we use the Redux reducer to do that. So one thing that's worth mentioning about our reducer is that everything inside it happens synchronously. And so that leaves the question of what do we do about our asynchronous stuff? This is saving our data and loading our data. Well, here we use Redux Saga, and Redux Saga is using the kind of generator syntax, and generators allow us to pause functions in the middle. And so this function here, edit row, it's got a star in front of it. That means it's a generator function, and it can be paused. And you can see it's got this yield command. So yield, take every edit row. So this says every time you get an edit row action called, then call edit row. And call edit row is another asynchronous function, and it's going to call our API. And you remember that our API used a promise, so it's taking in a promise, it's taking in some new row data, and it's calling the API. Now, because this is an HTTP, it would normally be an HTTP call. It could pass, or it could fail, it could resolve, or it could reject. And so we've put it in a try catch, and we put the kind of happy path here. So if it works, then we're going to create an action of type edit row succeeded, and you saw that running in our reducer. But if it fails, then in your application you want to do something if it fails, like pop up a toaster message saying couldn't save or something like that. And delete row is kind of similar. So take every delete row and then call delete row, and then it's going to call the API, and if it succeeds, it's going to dispatch an action called delete row succeeded with an ID, and that means we can then update our in-memory store if our call to the server worked. You can actually do things different ways. Here we've kind of got this model that the action will only take place if the call to the server is successful. So you do something, and it waits to see if the server agrees that it's okay to do that. And if the server agrees, then the action takes place on the screen. A better way of doing that is to do it the other way around. So you update it, and it updates on the screen automatically. And then if the action fails, then it rolls back the state to the previous state. It takes a little bit more work to get that working, and you can read up about that. It's just called optimistic updates. And so, I'd maybe suggest that. So the next thing to look at is probably our actions. And so you can see I've got filter actions and table actions. So filter actions is just setting our filter value, and our filter value is just a single string. And so if I put something here, so if I put CO in there, you can see, well, all that's really doing is dispatching a set filter action with a value of whatever I've typed into the text box. And I've got Redux DevTools installed, so I can see the actions that I've been doing in Redux DevTools. And I can actually roll actions back as well. So if I undo this action here, you'll see that the O disappears. And if I undo this one, you'll see that the C has disappeared. So I can basically go back and forward in time, and this is the property of time travel. So the next actions to look at are the table action creators, and we've got kind of add row, which is going to dispatch an event of type add row with some row data. Edit row is going to do the same thing. Actually, these are just backed by exactly the same case in our reducer. Delete row, which is going to take in an ID, and it's going to delete the row with that ID. And init rows, which is just going to do the trigger the initial loading of rows, and that's that init rows thing basically triggers something in our Redux Saga middleware, which gets hold of the rows and then initializes the data for our store. So let's take a look at our components, and one important thing is to try and break your components out as much as you can, or as much as it makes sense to. So I tend to keep each component in its own file, and I'm going to start at the kind of bottom. So we had our kind of view rows. So this is a row here, and this is what the component looks like. It takes in React. I'm using a function component, and I'm grabbing all the properties I want to display. The ID I'm using for updates and things like that. So check number, payee, amount, is void, status, on edit. And then I'm displaying each of these in a table row. And then I've got some styles which show how to display these rows. And I often define my styles inside the component itself. But if you're using Leapfrog, then you'll have CSS that goes alongside your components for doing this. So this takes in an onChange handler, and we're defining our onChange handler up here. So basically, if edit is selected, then we're going to call onEdit, which we're taking in as a property. And if delete is selected, then we're going to call onDelete, which we also take in as a prop. And this is ES 2015 kind of destructuring. And so basically what we're saying here is take event target dot value and then reassign that to value, and that allows us to have our if statement saying if value equals edit or if value equals delete. And the reason that we kind of take in our event handlers is that this component really doesn't have to be concerned about what to do when on edit or on delete happens. It just needs to know that it's going to do something, it's going to trigger something to happen. And so it passes in these handlers without knowing what they're going to do. But we also want the ability to edit our rows. So I've got this kind of edit row component, and the edit row component is pretty much the same as the view row component, except where we had kind of just plain text here before, we've got inputs now. So we've got kind of a series of input boxes, and I'm setting the default value to be the property that's being passed in, sort of check number, payee, amount, and is void. And is void is actually a checkbox rather than a normal input box. And then we've got the status there, and then we've got a save button. Now, for when you've got a series of inputs, it's often good to make it a form. The nice thing about a form is that it gives you an onSubmit handler. And what's different between an onSubmit and an onClick handler is that an onSubmit will trigger when you press enter, as well as when you hit the button. And also, because this form is wrapping all our inputs, it gives us an easier way of getting hold of the data or the value from these inputs. So I've got this function here, which is getting hold. So remember, in this case, the form is going to be the target of the submit event. So e.target.querySelector. So this is saying look for any children who have a property name of name, and then get the value. So this is like a get value function here. And so then when I want to get hold of the data from this row that I'm editing, I just create an object here, I mirror the ID, and then the check number is value kind of check number, payee, value payee, and then I need to do something a bit different for the checkbox. So e.target.querySelector.name is void, and then rather than value, I'm using checked, which will be Boolean, true or false. And in all of these, I've got default value, but for the checkbox, I've got default checked, and that's taking the isVoid property, which is these kind of properties which are coming in from our row. Now, I want to switch which row I'm displaying based on whether I'm in edit mode or not. So I want to be able to go into edit mode, and then it changes to being kind of editable. I'm going to take that filter off so I can see them all, and so you can see this row is editable and this row isn't, and then when I hit save, it kind of goes back to just being in view mode. So how do we do that? Well, we use a kind of a switcher component. So if I go into my row component here, and what this does, it takes in my edit row and it takes in my view row. Here I'm using a React class component, and the reason I'm using a class rather than a function component is because I want this component to have its own internal state. Now, I've got a choice here. I could, if I wanted to, store the state within the Redux store and use a reducer. An advantage of using the Redux reducer would be that here, so if I set this to edit mode, and if I make a change here that has no consequence, and then I do save, you can see that I'm actually losing the state when I do a code change here, and this is using kind of hot reloading. If that was stored in the Redux store, the in-memory Redux store, then actually it would maintain its state. I'm just going to reload the page there, and so when I reload the page, I get all the items back because they were hard-coded. So here we create a set state function, and the set state takes in is it edit or is edit true or false, and it sets the state of is edit. And this allows us to create our callback functions for the edit row and view row. So we've got this onView function, which is a callback which we pass to edit row, and this basically says after you've finished editing, it's going to call onView, and that's going to set this back to have the edit mode set to false, and so it's going to go back to view mode. So if I kind of do this and do edit, and then when I do save, it goes back to view mode, and you can see that in the edit row thing here. So we kind of have our on submit, we trigger the edit row handler, and this edit row handler is going to call our API, which is going to edit the row on the server, and then when that succeeds, it's going to trigger the edit row successful action, and that's going to update our in-memory store and make it in line with the data which would normally be stored on the server. And then after that's done, we trigger onView, which brings us back into our view mode. So back into the row component, and you can see that in our render method, we've basically got an if or else statement. And basically, if the state is set to edit, it's going to render an edit row for the row, and if the state is set to view row, then it's going to render a view row for the row component, and that's all it takes, and it passes down the functions that each of these components need. So it's passing down the delete row for the view row function, so that I can use the delete on the view row because it has this pull down box which allows me to delete rows there. So it's kind of creating the function to pass down. Now, this is a matter of taste, that it's probably better practice to actually define this logic here on the view row component itself, because this switcher component isn't actually using this data, it's just passing it around. But because this is just like a quick example, this is a slightly quicker way of writing it. I normally call a component that has this kind of if or else kind of functionality a switcher component. So it's a component which displays another component based on a condition and passes the properties down to the child component. And you can see here that I'm just spreading in the properties that come into this row, and spreading them into the child component, into the edit row or the view row. And there's only a slight difference between the kind of extra callbacks that these two different views take. But where are these properties coming from? So you remember that the properties that we were wanting were things like, let's see what we've got. We've got ID, check number, payee amount. Well, I'm getting hold of them in the table. And the table here is an example of a container component. So basically, the table is a list of rows. So it's got a table heading there. And then it's got this kind of mapping function over our rows. So if there are rows, then it's going to map the rows to row items. If there aren't rows, then it's just going to display loading. Now, there may not be rows, not because it's loading, it might be another reason for it. So this is just another case where it's an example. You might have to have more functionality there. And this component is passing down the information from the rows. So it's spreading in the information for the row. And then it's got the delete row and the edit row actions, which it's taking from here, filter actions and table actions. So how are we actually getting hold of these functions and properties in order to pass them down? You can see that they're coming into here. Well, this is what a container component does. So you can see that we're taking in connect from React Redux, and what that does is actually connects our component to the store and to the store's dispatcher. And so here we can see that we're wrapping our component in connect and passing in map state of props and also some actions which are going to be passed to the dispatcher. So our action creators kind of get wrapped in the dispatcher, and so that the dispatcher can dispatch any actions from filter actions and any actions from table actions. And that's why I'm able to get hold of set filter, delete row and edit row, which were actions kind of defined within these action files here. And then we've got our map state to props here. So I've got a map state to props function, and its job is to take properties from our store and map them onto properties for our component. So what's output here is properties for our component. So we're mapping out the property filter and the property rows, and we're saying if rows doesn't exist, then output an empty array, and if rows does exist, then turn the object into an array, so get the values from the object to create an array, and then we can sort that array. So basically this is sorting it based on the check number. So if I kind of reload this, you can see that I've got the check numbers here and it's sorted from low to high. But if I change this sort function to say kind of -1 there, and if I save that, you can see that the order flicks. Now I'm not reloading the browser here, it's just using a hot reloading to change this. And so if I delete this row here, and that's not deleted it from our hard-coded kind of database. It's just deleting it from our in-memory. It's deleted it from our in-memory database and our fake backend. But when I save in here, you can see that when it reorders, it's not refreshing the whole page, which would pull back in all of these rows. It's actually keeping the state data the same. And so this is one of the really powerful things in Redux. You do a bit more work in order to get your business data working in this way, but it can be really powerful when it comes to debugging and when it comes to writing your code, because you can make changes and see them very quickly. So we have our sort by check number here, and that's just using this by check number function, passing it into a normal array sort. And I think you wanted to filter by date, so you could create an equivalent function for by date here, or you could do one for each column so that when you clicked on these columns, it would sort by that column. Next, we use for filtering just a normal array filter function. And so this is going to take in a row. It's going to select the row.payee and convert it to lowercase, and then it's going to search for the filter, and the filter is just what comes in through this box. And if it finds it, it's going to return the index of the location of the find, and if not, it's going to return -1. And so basically, if it returns -1, then it's going to filter out that row. And so if I go back in here and reload, and I can then type in kind of subway, and you can see that kind of 2 lowercase means that even though I'm doing a small s and a small u, it's still finding subway there. But how does our table even know about our store? Well, that's configured higher up. So if I look in app is just rendering out table. I probably don't need this component here at all. I could probably just be taking a table and putting it in my index. And so if I go up to my index.js, you can see this is how our app is actually rendered out finally. So the app container here, this is what's giving us our hot reloading. So you can see app container is coming in from React hot loader, and then provider. Well, provider is taking in the store and it's putting it on React's context, and context allows you to pass something like properties down to all of your descendants, and then they can read them off the context. And so that's actually what's happening with Redux. So when we're setting up the Redux store here, it's actually creating a store, and then we pass that store into the provider, and the provider is providing the store to all of the descendants. And because the first descendant is app, that means that our store can be available to all of our child components. And then we're using the connect function to take the properties of the store that we want out of the context and making them available in the actual properties of the component itself. So a few words about our build and kind of other files in the project. These are some of the files here. So you've got kind of Babel RC. There are some kind of presets in here. So React, this is giving us GSX, and ES 2015 and stage 1. That's giving you some of the syntax that I was using within this example. Plugins, kind of React hot loader Babel, that was giving the kind of live reloading or hot reloading. And then I've got my then for the kind of JavaScript specific stuff, for kind of this is ESLint, and this is defining my coding style. So I've been using kind of a style where I'm not using semicolons, and where I've have a trailing comma on my kind of JSON data and my arrays. So that's kind of defined within here, that the style of my code. And in the code editor, if I do something that doesn't comply with this, it will give a warning. And so I get these kind of red dots in the margin when I put something which isn't valid. So you can see some red dots here warning me that I've got kind of console.log here, and that I've missed out a trailing comma there. So when I add that trailing comma in, then it kind of the red dot disappears. And if you click on a red dot, it gives you information about what's happening. So here it says const.log. And then I've got my kind of Webpack config. And in here, there's some things to make kind of React hot loader work. Babel polyfill, that's giving me some kind of ES 2015 functionality, and then the kind of stuff related to hot reloading. Now, I've not gone into loads of detail about all the concepts covered, but if you want to find out more, well, firstly, have a look at the source code, and you can see that here. And then to find out more about Redux, I really recommend going through this kind of getting started with Redux Egghead.io lesson. You can find that here. And so that's got kind of 30 lessons for getting started with Redux. And then there is also a follow-up course, which is building React applications with idiomatic Redux. And I'd recommend giving that a look at as well.